Welcome to Inside the Courtroom, the lori-vallow-trial. We're glad you're here with us as we dive into this trial and bring you some in-depth coverage throughout this week of testimony where we saw a lot of very technical, a lot of expertise in latent fingerprints, DNA. I mean, we've been reading the comments. We see your texts. We get those questions from you about what evidence is there. We heard a lot about circumstantial coming into this, but what we heard this week, especially Wednesday or yesterday, Thursday, was a lot of very specific scientific, unarguable evidence, right, about DNA fingerprints. So let's talk a little bit about that. So what did our lab folks, what were they able to give us in terms of definitive proof of connections to either Lori, Chad, Alex, which is Lori's brother, and the children found on Daybell's property? What do we know from yesterday's testimony?
Well, I just think we should start with the most damning evidence that came out of this, and that was Alex Cox's fingerprints on the bag that JJ was found in. And we know that JJ Vallow was found bound, duct taped, a plastic bag over his head, but over him, he was wrapped up in a plastic, like a black plastic bag. And the lab tech took pieces and parts of all of that, and really how she described it is you can use a type of gas and you basically spray it onto the surface and it will light up a fingerprint, or you can dust for it. There's multiple ways they do that, and they take the fingerprint, they match it to the samples that they have, and Alex Cox was already in the system because he was a felon, so she matched it to him and she said that was a match. And she found other fingerprints, but some of them were unidentifiable or just not able to get a good match off of. But she said she also found a palm print of Alex on that bag as well. Yeah, and we actually will listen to that testimony in just a moment. And to kind of set the scene and to kind of give some context, this was hours of testimony in terms of throughout the day explaining, really specifically about the expertise that each one of these witnesses has, the education, how they test, as you pointed out, and they talk about the very specific natures of how they actually do the tests and how reliable are they. At one point, they were talking about DNA evidence. You're talking about how reliable. 604 octillion times. DNA doesn't lie. DNA that they found in this fire debris that we know associated with Tylee. We know that's where her remains were found. And talking about the specific nature, she said it's 604 octillion times. How many zeros is that? 27 zeros, the prosecutors ask. Times more likely to be Tylee Ryan's than anyone else in the public. So, that's as definitive as it gets, obviously. So we know they can connect, and it's not a question. There's no question about whether or not these children were found on this property, right? That's not what the argument is. But once they have to set that scene in order to then start connecting things like tools that were found on the property. There is so much foundation building that they have to go through to even get to that point. And so I think really the scientific evidence was the meat of yesterday, and just the absolute expertise these people have in this field is unbelievable.
The pickaxe, to talk about that.
Yeah, so going back to Tylee, Douglas Hale-Posca, I believe his name was, and he is a FBI tool mark specialist, which is such a specific job. Very. He is so smart. He's absolutely so smart, and the way he was explaining things, it got really technical, but to just kind of sum it all up, he took castings of Tylee Ryan's bones, and those castings are just made with silicone, and it's kind of like a mold essentially, and it's easier for him to see the marks made from those castings because he can observe, without really taking the bone and messing with the bone, he can observe that casting specifically and look at the indentations where he took that casting and the marks from that, right? So he said, and we know from previous testimony, these injuries or trauma occurred at or around the time of Tylee's death. We don't know if it killed her, but we can safely assume that she could have been alive or maybe she died because of this.
Well, they said homicide by unspecified
Exactly.
means, so that's the final
So
determination.
it's really like we don't know.
Yeah.
Right.
And so these injuries or wounds or trauma to her bones, he said that there are 3 types of these, I guess, indentations that he's looking for.
Types of force.
Yes.
That were inflicted at some point on these bones.
Yes, and those would be stabbing, chopping, or like an unidentified blunt force type.
Compression, I think, is what they called that too.
Yeah, and those can come. He knows because chopping is basically over a wider surface area, whereas stabbing is more of like a smaller surface area, more specific, is how I understood it. And she had all of these,
Yeah.
and they were all on her hip bones, her pelvis, her pubic area, and he said he knew that he said I think he had 18 tools laid out, just like comparing those. And he believed it was either a cleaver, a hatchet, or a machete, or something along those lines, something close to that. He said,
Right.
I can't say what specific type of tool, what brand, I can't say anything about that, I can't say why, but I can say that it was something like that. It was a bladed tool.
Yeah, and the defense attorney on cross did kind of point to that and sort of want to pick that apart a little bit and ask him, can you, if you didn't have a tool to test, how can you actually say that that's what caused it? And so he was very, clear about what he's saying is it's consistent with, and it's obviously it's consistent with a gunshot does not mean I have the actual gun that fired the weapon, but experts could be able to say this injury is consistent with a gunshot wound.
It's like the University of Idaho murders. You can not have the murder weapon necessarily, but say these wounds are consistent with a stab wound of this type of blade. I mean, there's experts that do this for a living all day.
Well, I mean,
that
his subject is so specific. I mean, this is what he does all day. And, he said some of these wounds didn't penetrate the hard layer of the bone.
Right.
Some of them did.
Yeah.
Some of them were so forceful, and it's just like a graphic warning, they were so forceful that he noticed when he flipped the bone over that the trauma was on the other side of the bone, that force. And it goes to show how just brutal and awful this
Who
was.
does that?
And we also know that a Idaho State Police forensic chemist testified.
Yeah.
And these people are like the best of the best. And he's explained how he figures this out. But basically, he was brought to do a chemical analysis on part of Tylee's remains, and he discovered gasoline.
Yeah.
So we know her remains were burned, but I mean, how is the question? Well, someone poured gasoline on her.
Yeah.
And we have not one of us loses sight of the fact that these, when we talk about the chopping and the bones, I mean, jurors are looking at this and certainly they're getting very specific about a specific wound or specific injury, a specific type of force on a specific bone, but no one's losing sight of the fact that belonged to a 16-year-old girl.
Absolutely.
100%.
A 7-year-old boy. And so when we talk about it is graphic and it is very detailed and it is gruesome. There is nothing short of gruesome about this. And yet what is so amazing, I guess, and so interesting is that does give us a lot of insight. And that's something that people have asked for, right? We want to understand more. And the only way to even begin to piece this together is to get very specific and very detailed about what evidence is there. You talked about the fire debris. Again, that's one of those very specific experts who was able to speak to going through the ash and looking and being able to determine was it flesh, was there gasoline, were there accelerants, things like that.
I mean, he can even determine what direction these came from. And so, like, when we're looking at part of the bone, there you can see like thick marks, indentations in 3 sections. So like 3 times this happened on one bone. And he said, well, the chopping action was perpendicular. So that's interesting to me, is how he can tell that, what direction those were coming in. And he could even say it was going from left to right. He could say in what way. And
if
so
it's diagonal or coming from,
and some of those bones this was so forceful that it fragmented the bone. The indentation, it had cracked the bone, the rest of the bone around it, because it was so forceful, and that's unbelievable. Yeah. And honestly, it's not lost on us that these Absolutely. Are children, and it's horrible for everybody in the courtroom. But
we have audio too.
And that's it. Let's get into that, because that's the. So we talked a little bit about those prints, and I think this was for me probably the most definitive. I guess the first time we have heard a name attached directly to a very obvious piece of evidence tied directly to one of these deaths.
Absolutely.
Is that fair?
With Completely.
Exactly. Yeah. So let's listen. This is Tara Martinez. She is a forensic expert who does latent fingerprints, and she speaks to what she was able to determine when examining that bag that Alex just spoke about, the bag that was found wrapped around JJ.
And was there sufficient quality to that print for you to be able to do any comparison to that one?
Yes.
Who did you compare it to? What knowns did you compare it to?
For both prints, I compared to Lori-Vallow, Chad Daybell, JJ Vallow, and Alexander Cox.
Okay, and did your comparison yield any conclusions?
Yes, I identified it to the right palm, so this part of your hand in here, to Alexander Lamar Cox.
And so evaluation of item 11 in the lab, the black plastic with the duct tape, yielded 2 latent prints, correct?
Yes.
And both of those latent prints matched the known prints of whom?
Alexander Lamar Cox.
We're talking about, that's the palm print you were talking about, the fingerprint and a palm print. I mean, I think you can explain, she's kind of explaining, and it sounds like demonstrating on her own hand what the area of the hand would be. So that, in addition to evidence about, I'm going to say weapons, but tools. I think they in fact use the word tools that were found and seized from the Daybell property. Is there a connection there? Were they able to draw some ties there?
Yeah, I mean, one of the lab forensic examiners from ISP examined multiple tools she was given from the Daybell property, tons of shovels. So one shovel had Tylee's DNA on it, like flesh. The pickaxe, however, had flesh on it, and it also had Tylee's blood on the handle, and it was blood stained, and so she was able to test that and match it to Tylee. Now the previous expert said either it was a hatchet, it was something like that. Could have been that pickaxe. Right. We just don't know, but the jury, it's up to the jury to connect those dots.
And of course, the reason we don't know is because of the way in which Tylee's body was ultimately found, right? It was in different pieces and parts and melted and burned.
And honestly, we don't know also what other evidence and what other pieces they're going to be able to pull together as this trial moves on, because we don't get a preview of everything
a lot along the way.
Of everything that's going to be said. Now, today, as we moved into today, shifting from the 2 children to Tammy's death.
Yeah.
Right? And this is the first time we've really heard a lot about that. I mean, in terms of the specifics and details about that.
Well, and I think why is because, Lori's charged with conspiracy to commit murder and theft in Tammy's death as it relates to her life insurance policy and how she schemed with Chad, allegedly. She's not charged with first-degree murder in Tammy's death. Right. But they do still have to talk about Tammy's murder and any conspiracy around it. And so we'll hear more about that in Chad's trial. Right. But as far as it goes for today with Tammy, we first heard from her sister, who she ended the day yesterday on the witness stand.
Tammy's sister,
Samantha William, who yesterday emotional. Today it was really, really difficult to hear her talk about her sister. They used to live in Utah, and they were really close. And then Tammy and Chad moved to Idaho, she said, about 3 or 4 years before her death,
and it was
which was in 2019, Chad's idea to move to Rexburg. And, she was living her life, though. She was teaching. She was a librarian out of school. She was taking dance classes. She was a computer whiz. And her sister gave that personal element to Tammy, which we have not gotten throughout this trial.
She was like an animal lover. She loved her kids. She loved her grandkids. She loved people. She cared for like chickens and dogs.
Great mother of 5. And I think, like you said, the first time we've really heard about her. And so that was what today entirely was spent on, was Tammy's death and who she was. And what her sister essentially said was, when she found out that Chad had remarried Lori 2 weeks later. Yeah. After her sister's death, she was devastated. Her sister died overnight on a Saturday, and then it was Tuesday that the following Tuesday, Chad decided to hold her funeral, not in Idaho, but in Utah. And we learned throughout trial, it was on that day that Lori Vallow was, based on Google searches, looking for wedding dresses.
Yeah.
So this was all, something that they were planning in the background. We know Chad and Lori were having an affair, as we've learned through this trial. And this was something that Lori was very privy to. And what we also learned early on in this trial was that they did determine, it was the first time they released this, Tammy Daybell died by asphyxiation. It was a homicide. They didn't determine that right after she died.
Yeah.
They determined that months later, in December of 2019, when they exhumed her body and decided, you know what, we're going to run an autopsy.
And of course, a lot of people then starting to say, now in hindsight, looks very interesting that you potentially rush a funeral, do that in a way that doesn't seem maybe what people expected you to do when at the death of a spouse. And so a lot of that information coming in. Also some inconsistencies in terms of Chad telling people that she had been very sick.
Yes.
And, her sister Samantha saying, no, not at all, right? I mean,
she was going to run a 5K.
Yeah.
She was healthy.
They had at least 3 people testify today to her health, in fact, to the prosecution, to prove the point that Tammy was not sick before she died.
Right.
But we heard the story from the law enforcement officers that were on scene, as well as the coroners, the deputy coroner and the coroner in Fremont County that responded. And they said that what Chad told them was, in the middle of the night, Tammy had woken up. She was having a coughing fit. She ran to the bathroom down the hallway. She threw up. Chad woke up and he went down the hallway to help her clean up and then kind of ushered her back to the bed. They fell asleep. And at 5:40 or 5:30 in the morning, he woke up because Tammy had fallen off the bed. Her feet were wrapped in the sheet. Her head was on the ground. And the rest of her body was up on the bed still. So that's what he described happened and how he woke up. He said he tried waking her up. She was unconscious. And then he realized something was really wrong. And then he got his son, Garth. They called 911. We heard the 911 call today from when they called and asked for help. But essentially, they didn't ask for an ambulance. They said she's dead. Verbatim, he said she's frozen. And when they got there, they realized that was true. And she'd already had lividity, which is when your body's discolored because you've been lifeless for quite a while.
Right.
They determined time of death was between 12 and 2:30 in the morning. And she had this, and Alex and I saw photos, the jurors saw photos, she had this pink foam on her cheek. So these are the photos that we're seeing of Tammy. And we're all going, this is odd.
Right, what is that, or what causes that?
Yeah, they had ruled at the time it was natural causes. And in fact, they said a pulmonary edema, so very specific without running an autopsy at the time. So in October, when the deputies got there, they're going, and the coroners, this is odd, and she's only 49 years old.
Right.
This seems a little weird, but they didn't think anything was suspicious.
Well, Chad also said he said to the coroner, Brenda Dye, she's
been off.
Seizures, she's been off, she's had fainting spells.
She's been
but
clumsy.
that was only when the coroner asked, has she had seizures or has she had these spells? And he said, oh, yes, absolutely.
Now that you mention it,
she's
she
had,
has.
and hypertension, like low blood pressure, and apparently her daughter had also testified to this. So based on what Chad told her, as well as what the daughter said, and in cooperation with authorities as well as anybody in the mortuary, the coroner decided they're not going to do an autopsy. You really only do that. A family member has to ask for one, or there has to be suspicion of criminal activity to run one or to do one. So ultimately, they decided not to. And then again, they decided pulmonary edema. But the pink foam it's weird to everybody. And at least in my mind, and I know Alex and I were talking about this, I can't say I'm a professional, but if I was somebody investigating this, I would want to know what that was.
Well, I mean, even the deputy coroner was confused because she said, well, I actually thought it could be related to poison, so I Googled it.
She Googled it there.
And, she Googled it at the scene, which,
That's interesting.
she said she's never seen anything like this, so I guess if you had never seen it, you wouldn't know.
Sure.
But, when the coroner came on, she was like, that's something's up there. And we know just from like some quick research I did was that usually this fluid, it happens when you have respiratory problems or something with your lungs, and that can be consistent
lack
with
of oxygen.
Yeah, that can be consistent with asphyxiation, but it could also not be.
Right. It can also be pulmonary edema, which is that swelling and that like your pulmonary system and your breathing and all of that, which does happen. Obviously, far more often you see someone die of pulmonary edema more so than being poisoned or being killed by someone laying next to them. So, it's easy to armchair quarterback that, but it certainly is a question. And we haven't seen toxicology reports. No. We haven't seen any of that. And so again, will there be more information specific about Tammy's death, whether it's in this trial or
In Chad's.
we certainly expect, you would certainly expect to see that in Chad Daybell's, because he's the one accused of murder in her case.
Right. And I think it's difficult too because, you know, again, armchair quarterback, these
Sure.
coroners that are on scene and even the Fremont County Sheriff's deputies, Chad is distraught. On the 911 call, he is crying. He is distraught. They're not thinking, this is a suspicious husband. Nothing looked out of place in the home. She had no bruise. She had like an old bruise on her bicep, they said. But otherwise...
The interesting thing they did point out was that the bed, did you see the bed?
Yeah,
in
the bed was
photo?
off the box
It
spring.
was off the box spring. Like, it was like, not like crazy looking, but it was definitely like something moved. Like you can't just move. Like, my bed's on a box spring. You can't just hit it with your
Right.
hip
Yeah.
and
And
it
have it
moves.
shift that
Like,
much.
it
Yeah.
was moved. And she said, oh yeah, I noticed it, but I still didn't think anything was suspicious.
Because no
Right.
other obvious sign of like a struggle in terms of like injuries to her body that we know of.
The other thing too, though, and I forgot to point this out, is that she had fallen off the bed, as I described,
Yeah.
but then Chad and Garth had moved her and put her on the bed. So they may be thinking, and they admitted that. They were like, we picked her body up, we put it on the bed. You know, perhaps the coroners are thinking, oh, the box spring moved when,
Right.
or they didn't notice it at the time. But I think it's difficult with this in particular. We know Chad is charged with murder, but that, as we've seen with these other charges, we don't know that necessarily he was the one who they believe allegedly killed her, right? Somebody else could have been involved here. We know, based on what we've heard earlier in this trial this week from geolocation records, Alex Cox's phone had been near the Daybell's property in Salem, which is in Fremont County outside Rexburg, the night before
Right.
Tammy
Potentially
died.
hours before.
Just
Yeah,
hours,
it was like the same. I mean, she died possibly like October 18th, 19th, in between there,
Right.
and Alex Cox's phone was around there on October 18th.
Exactly.
in
At
like
10
4
o'clock at night.
hours before.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's definitely like connecting the dots.
Sure.
Here,
Yeah,
but-
certainly huge
And
question marks.
going back to what this is supposed to be, providing context, Alex is the one
Right.
that Lori has said in her alibi her kids were killed at his apartment. He admitted that he believed he was their fall guy. So that's sort of the theory right now,
Yeah.
is that Lori and Chad conspired, and they conspired with Alex because they had this sort of power over him and this religious power over him, and he's the one that allegedly carried out the attacks.
Right. And interesting to, extending that a little bit, you were able to speak to, so Rex Connor is
Yeah.
Lori's uncle, so Lori's mother's brother, who came into
Yeah.
town to watch the trial. He said he wanted to see it in person. He brought 3 of his daughters, so 3 of Lori's cousins. I know you spoke to him, and I want to hear
Yeah.
what, kind of that kind of what that conversation was like. But I listened to it, and it was, what's interesting to me is I think, first of all, he's relatively pleasant in the way that he spoke, and was very quick to say, seeing her for the first time in 5 years, even in this context.
5 years. That's crazy.
First time that he saw her, he said it was, he smiled.
Yeah.
And he said, immediately you think of all the positive memories.
Yeah.
And then he pointed out that, but also then you realize where you are,
Snap
why
back.
you're here.
Exactly.
And said then that smile fades.
That's
so
awful.
he spoke to the pain that this family has gone through, for sure. What do you think, what did you take away from what he has experienced in hearing all of this week?
I mean, so much. This all started in 2019 for him, really. I mean, as it was testified to earlier in the trial, Charles Vallow, Lori's ex-husband, who's now dead at the hands of Alex Cox, without a doubt, he shot and killed, admitted to it. Charles Vallow had sent an email out to all of Lori Vallow's family members and said, something's up with Lori. Things are really wrong. I really am pleading with you guys to intervene and to know that something's up. And he attached pictures and copies of her light and dark skills, as we've talked about many times on this show, is how her and Chad raided people. And if you were dark, you were possessed by a zombie, which is what she says JJ and Tylee were, and why they needed to go, right? And Tammy. So anyway, fast forward to when that email had already been in his mind, right? And he's going, I believe Charles. This is not Charles.
He said that everything he's saying sounds like Lori, right?
And then he said Lori is gaslighting the family.
Yeah.
So fast forward to when the kids are reported missing in November of 2019, and Kay and Larry call attention to it. And there's this manhunt going. He's going, based on Charles's email, he was sort of on the side of Charles. and a mom that is not giving any explanation as to where her children are. Right away, as more details were coming out, he said Lori has got to be involved.
Yeah.
That's what he said. And what's really sad is that this really divided his family and his extended family, but more so the immediate family. So his sister, Lori's mom, and everybody in their family, Summer Shiflett, Adam Cox, and the people that believed that, Lori had nothing to do with it, and the people that didn't. And then ultimately it wasn't until the kids' bodies were found that everybody was sort of on the same page.
Right, I was going to say, and then when we'll speak, let's listen to what he said about, being in the courtroom this week and what he's able to, kind of how his thought process has gone as he's watched and listened to the testimony.
Well, I believe Chad and Lori were a lot more involved than I did before going to the trial and hearing all the details, all the evidence. So yes, I believe all three of them are serial killers. And as far as who did the dirty work, hearing the detail on Wednesday in court, first of all, it doesn't matter to me who did, the actual dirty work. If you're involved in this to any degree, and I'm talking about other people that may not be these three, if you're involved in any degree, you are guilty of their deaths. Okay, so it doesn't matter much to me who held what or did what with what weapon. They are all very involved.
Interesting, because that's exactly what prosecutors are hoping that the jury also believes, is that we may not know exactly what weapon used by whom, but he said, walking away from listening to this testimony this week, he called them tremendous evil. He said that there is no doubt, and he even spoke to if there's anyone else who is not one of these three, he believes that they are culpable. He spoke to the kind of that idea too. He is a member of the LDS faith. He is still, looking to, his spiritual support. Does he believe that she believed this? I mean, kind of what is that? How does that play into it?
I asked that, and I think based on the podcast we did with Lauren Matthias, who is LDS and can speak to the teachings in the LDS faith, this is not at all something that you're taught growing up. And he said Lori and Chad definitely did not believe what they were pushing. And that to me was really surprising because, again, based off of our conversation with Lauren and the way I've been following this trial is that everything was very rooted in their religious extremism and their beliefs. But he said, nope, I think that they use their religious beliefs and teachings to manipulate others, specifically Alex, to do the dirty work, and they didn't buy it. He said, as the prosecutors laid out in their opening statements, and as Adam has said, this is about money, lust, sex, and power.
So he thinks that this religious stuff was just all a lie.
He thinks that
it's gaslighting. I mean, he ultimately uses that word even and said he thinks that he thinks that was a manipulation. They wanted people to believe that's what it was rooted in.
Exactly, but they themselves did not believe it. That's what he says.
But I mean, and then once again, to play devil's advocate here, why spend so much time holding these meetings and podcasts and telling your friends? And I mean,
and was the goal ultimately to kill people? I don't know.
Right.
Yeah, I guess.
And does it start with, the basis? I mean, maybe potentially it starts with this idea that, yes, you do believe some of it, but then as it gets more extreme and it becomes more of a manipulation, maybe that's what the argument would be. I don't know, but it is, that is something that he did say, that's, you spoke to that, the division. But he also said, I think he called it the silver lining, right? If there is a silver lining in this, it is that there is no other side. Yeah. He said, initially people were, and he spoke about Summer. So Summer, Lori's sister, who testified and said, wow, how powerful that testimony was, and the desperation that we heard in Summer's voice, and how she was able to put a voice to that. And he certainly had a lot of good things to say about her and was happy to see her this week. But he also said that, he knows that Lori's mom and Lori's sister did defend her, and there was a division there, and yet in the end, when the two children were found dead on Daybell's property, then everyone came together and were forced to believe what they didn't want to believe. Yeah. And now he says that's actually united them, and in fact, he speaks about the country, everyone following this. That he feels like that's the silver lining.
Well, everyone's united in wanting answers in this case, and we know. We are not going to get all the answers. Yeah. Jurors are not going to get all the answers. We saw it play out this week with Tylee, homicide by unknown.
There's going to be things that you just won't know.
And that's got to be absolutely crushing for family members of the victims. You think about Kay and Larry Woodcock, you think about Rex and his kids and everybody involved. They're not going to get all the answers, but what he said is, I hope come sentencing that there is going to be peace.
Yeah.
And he said, and I know, based on his faith, that it's after this life that you face your outcome. So I don't know. I think it remains to be seen what happens with this family, but he said they are working on healing. They've been actively working on it together. They're really united in this. They're certainly not there to show support for Lori, that's for sure.
And we'll continue to talk about him and some of the insight that he gave us, because we do, try to connect the person and the story and let people know the history both of Lori Vallow and also the people that she's now accused of killing or conspiring to kill. So we will continue to bring you those details, and we're glad you're here with us. If you have questions or you have comments or you want us to look into something for you, you can text us 208-321-5614 and join us for next Inside the Courtroom.